When historians celebrate the Allied victory in World War II, they focus on brave soldiers, brilliant generals, and superior weapons. Yet they miss the most critical factor that actually determined the outcome: logistics. German generals initially laughed at American obsession with supply chains, dismissing such concerns as merchant preoccupations rather than warrior priorities. But that contemptuous laughter died as Wehrmacht officers watched American forces operate with material abundance beyond comprehension, sustained by supply systems so sophisticated they redefined modern warfare. This is the untold story of how gasoline, cargo trucks, and organizational genius defeated tactical brilliance and fighting spirit, how America didn't just outfight Germany, but outsupplied them into submission. The logistics revolution that emerged from desperate necessity transformed not only how wars are won, but how the entire modern world functions, establishing principles that continue shaping our lives 8 decades later. Share this eye-opening perspective with history enthusiasts who deserve to know the real story behind victory. Subscribe for more insights into the overlooked forces that shaped our world, and join the conversation by commenting on how logistics continues to define power in the 21st century. Because the unsung heroes who moved supplies deserve recognition alongside those who fought, and their legacy lives in every supply chain that spans our globalized world. When German generals laughed at American logistics. The Second World War witnessed one of history's most profound underestimations, when German military leadership dismissed American logistical capabilities with contemptuous laughter. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic for the Third Reich, as the very system they ridiculed became the engine that powered Allied victory across multiple theaters of war. The story of German derision toward American logistics reveals not merely a tactical error but a fundamental failure to comprehend how industrial warfare had evolved, and how deeply American organizational genius would reshape the nature of modern combat. In the early years of World War II, German generals had every reason to feel supremely confident. Their Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, overrun France in barely more than a month, and pushed deep into Soviet territory with seemingly unstoppable momentum. The Blitzkrieg doctrine had revolutionized warfare, emphasizing speed, concentrated force, and tactical brilliance. German officers, steeped in a military tradition dating back to Frederick the Great and refined through the Prussian General Staff system, considered themselves the world's foremost military professionals. They viewed war as an art form, requiring intellectual sophistication, strategic vision, and warrior spirit. When they examined American military preparations, they saw something entirely different. A nation of shopkeepers and farmers playing at soldiering, obsessed with mundane details like supply chains and production schedules rather than the glorious realities of combat. German intelligence reports from the late 1930s and early 1940s reinforced this dismissive attitude. Observers noted that the American military ranked 18th in the world in size, smaller than Romania's forces. The United States Army conducted maneuvers with wooden rifles and trucks, labeled as tanks because actual equipment was so scarce. German officers read these reports and laughed, confident that American industrial might, while impressive in peacetime consumer goods, could never translate into effective military power. They fundamentally misunderstood what they were witnessing: not weakness, but a nation that had not yet mobilized its extraordinary latent capabilities. The German conception of logistics remained rooted in traditional European warfare. Their armies still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, with hundreds of thousands of horses supporting even their most mechanized divisions. German logistics emphasized living off the land, capturing enemy supplies, and maintaining relatively short supply lines from their Central European base. This approach had worked brilliantly in the conquest of France, where well-developed road and rail networks existed and distances were manageable. It functioned adequately, though with increasing strain, In the early phases of the Russian campaign, German planners believed that superior tactics and fighting spirit could overcome logistical limitations, that brilliant generals could win wars even when supplies ran short. American military thinkers approached warfare from an entirely different philosophical foundation. They understood that modern industrial warfare was fundamentally a contest of production, distribution, and sustainment. Wars would be won not merely by brave soldiers and clever tactics, but by the side that could deliver overwhelming material superiority to the battlefield and sustain it indefinitely. This insight was not born from cowardice or lack of martial spirit, but from a clear-eyed assessment of how industrialization had transformed human conflict. The American military would not simply fight. It would build a machine capable of projecting power across entire oceans and maintaining that projection for years. When German generals learned of American logistical planning, their laughter grew louder. Intelligence reports described American plans to build massive port facilities, establish supply depots, create standardized shipping containers, develop global communications networks, and produce equipment in quantities that seemed absurd. The Americans planned to provide their soldiers with levels of supply that German troops could scarcely imagine. Multiple uniforms, abundant ammunition, plentiful food including luxuries, comprehensive medical care, regular mail service, and even recreational facilities near combat zones. To German officers accustomed to austerity and sacrifice, this seemed like decadent nonsense, proof that Americans lacked the hardness necessary for serious warfare. The scale of American ambition was genuinely difficult for traditional military minds to comprehend. The United States planned to fight a two-ocean war, projecting force simultaneously across the Atlantic and Pacific, while also supplying allies around the globe. This required not incremental improvements in logistics, but a complete reimagining of how military forces could be sustained. American planners calculated that fighting in Europe would require moving millions of tons of supplies monthly across thousands of miles of ocean, then distributing those supplies across a continent to armies advancing on multiple fronts. They understood that every soldier at the front required a tail of support personnel, ships, trucks, warehouses, and communications infrastructure stretching back to factories in Detroit, farms in Kansas, and training bases in Texas. German ridicule intensified as American production figures began appearing in intelligence reports. The numbers seemed impossible. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, millions of rifles. German analysts assumed these figures were propaganda, or that American equipment must be shoddily made, incapable of withstanding combat conditions. They could not accept that American industry, given proper organization and motivation, could achieve such output while maintaining quality standards. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Surely the nation that produced Hollywood films and jazz music could not also produce the world's most formidable war machine. Reality began asserting itself when American forces entered combat in North Africa during 1942 and 43. German commanders fighting in Tunisia encountered something unprecedented, an enemy that seemed to have unlimited supplies. American units that suffered setbacks simply reconstituted themselves with fresh equipment and returned to battle. Artillery ammunition was expended at rates German forces could never match. Damaged vehicles were quickly replaced rather than painstakingly repaired. The Americans even had dedicated units whose sole purpose was recovering and evacuating damaged equipment, something the resource-strapped Germans considered an impossible luxury. The invasion of Sicily and then Italy demonstrated American logistics on a larger scale. The amphibious landings required coordinating thousands of ships, landing craft, and aircraft to deliver assault forces and their supplies onto hostile shores. Once ashore, American forces established port facilities with astonishing speed, often making captured harbors operational within days, despite German demolition efforts. Supply convoys flowed with clockwork regularity. sustaining armies as they pushed inland through difficult terrain against determined resistance. German defenders noticed that American units rarely seemed constrained by supply shortages. If anything, they appeared to have more equipment than they needed. The Normandy invasion of June 1944 finally shattered any remaining German illusions about American logistical incompetence. The operation represented the culmination of years of planning and preparation, a logistical achievement without parallel in military history. American and Allied forces landed over 150,000 troops on the first day, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. Within weeks, they had landed over 1 million soldiers, along with their vehicles, equipment, and supplies. The artificial Mulberry harbors, prefabricated in Britain and towed across the English Channel, exemplified the audacious engineering that characterized American logistics. When storms destroyed one Mulberry harbor, American ingenuity adapted, finding alternative methods to maintain the flow of supplies. As Allied forces broke out from Normandy and raced across France, German commanders witnessed the full, terrifying efficiency of American logistics in mobile warfare. The Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system using thousands of trucks driven around the clock, delivered supplies from Normandy beaches to advancing units hundreds of miles away. American soldiers advanced so rapidly that they literally outran their supply lines. Yet even this overextension demonstrated logistical capability. Armies that moved so fast they exhausted their fuel had traveled farther and faster than German forces in France 4 years earlier, and they did so while maintaining cohesion and combat effectiveness. German generals who had laughed now faced a nightmare opponent. American armies did not merely fight, they overwhelmed through sheer material abundance. Every battle saw American forces, supported by artillery barrages of devastating intensity, air support available on call, and reserves of equipment that seemed inexhaustible. German units learned to dread the methodical American approach. Reconnaissance, artillery preparation, infantry assault, all supported by a supply system that ensured ammunition never ran short and reinforcements always arrived. The Americans could afford to use firepower lavishly to save infantry lives, a calculation impossible for resource-depleted German forces. The final campaigns in Germany itself revealed the ultimate consequences of German miscalculation. By 1945, Wehrmacht units struggled with critical shortages of fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. German soldiers fought bravely but increasingly hopelessly, knowing that losses could not be replaced, that damaged equipment would not be repaired, that today's ammunition expenditure meant less available tomorrow. Meanwhile, American forces operated with such logistical abundance that they could sustain simultaneous offensives across a front, stretching from the Netherlands to Austria. American commanders made decisions, knowing that supply would not be a limiting factor. They could concentrate forces, commit reserves, and maintain pressure because the logistical machine supporting them functioned with relentless efficiency. The laughter of German generals had died completely, replaced by bitter recognition. They had dismissed American logistics as the obsession of merchants and bureaucrats, failing to understand that modern warfare rewarded exactly those capabilities. The Germans had created brilliant tactical systems and possessed superb combat soldiers, but they fought within an organizational framework that could not compete with American industrial and logistical power. American logistics was not peripheral to victory. It was victory itself, the essential foundation upon which all tactical and strategic success rested. The nation that German professionals had ridiculed as logistically incompetent had created the most effective military supply system in human history, one that projected overwhelming power across the globe and sustained it until final victory was achieved. The lesson was profound and permanent. In industrial warfare, logistics is destiny, and those who dismiss it do so at their ultimate peril. The impossible equation, Patton's fuel problem. The summer of 1944 presented General George S. Patton with a mathematical paradox that would torment him for months and fundamentally shape the final year of World War II in Europe. His Third Army had broken out from Normandy and was racing across France with a speed that shocked both the retreating Germans and Allied high command. Patton's armored spearheads were slicing through enemy resistance, liberating French towns at a pace of 50 miles per day, destroying German units that could not retreat fast enough, and creating the possibility of ending the war before Christmas. Yet, this magnificent offensive was being strangled not by German resistance, but by an impossible equation. Patton's tanks were consuming fuel faster than the Allied supply system could deliver it, and the gap between consumption and delivery grew wider with every mile his forces advanced. This fuel crisis would become one of the most controversial logistical challenges of the entire war, a problem that seemed simple on its surface, but contained layers of complexity that defied easy solution. Patton's fuel problem began with the very success of the Normandy breakout itself. Allied planning had anticipated a grinding campaign through France, with German forces making determined stands behind river lines and in fortified cities, slowing the advance to perhaps 10 or 15 miles per day at best. Supply plans were built around these assumptions, with carefully calculated schedules for expanding port capacity, building fuel pipelines, and establishing forward supply depots. Everything was designed for methodical warfare, not the explosive mobility that actually occurred. When Patton's armor punched through at Avranches in late July and began sweeping across Brittany and then eastward toward the Seine, he immediately began outrunning the logistical infrastructure that was supposed to support him. The triumph of his tactical genius created an unsolvable supply crisis. The mathematics of fuel consumption in mobile armored warfare were brutally unforgiving. A single Sherman tank consumed approximately 1 gallon of gasoline for every 4 to 6 miles traveled on roads, worse in combat conditions or difficult terrain. Patton's Third Army contained hundreds of these tanks, along with thousands of trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and other vehicles, all burning fuel constantly. At the height of the advance, Third Army was consuming approximately 400,000 gallons of fuel daily, a staggering figure that represented only their minimum needs for continued offensive operations. When Patton wanted to maintain maximum pressure on retreating Germans, his actual requirements could exceed 800,000 gallons per day. These numbers represented more than statistics. They embodied the fundamental challenge of projecting mechanized military power across continental distances. The supply chain stretching back to deliver this fuel was a marvel of organization, yet it could not keep pace with Patton's advance. Fuel began its journey in tanker ships, crossing the Atlantic from American refineries. These ships unloaded at French ports, initially only the invasion beaches and the limited facilities at Cherbourg, which had been badly damaged during its capture. From the ports, fuel moved to forward supply depots via the famous Red Ball Express, a convoy system that employed thousands of trucks, driving continuously in a one-way loop from Normandy to the advancing front lines. Each truck could carry perhaps 2,000 gallons, meaning that sustaining Patton's offensive required hundreds of truck trips daily, and every mile Patton advanced eastward added 2 miles to each truck's round trip, as they had to drive both directions. The trucks themselves consumed fuel, creating a cascading problem where an increasing percentage of transported fuel was being burned by the transport system itself. Patton watched this logistical equation with growing fury, because he understood that time was the most precious resource in warfare. Every day his advance stalled for lack of fuel was a day the Germans could reorganize their shattered forces, establish new defensive lines, and bring up reinforcements from Germany. He could see the strategic prize tantalizing close, the Rhine River, perhaps even the Ruhr industrial region, objectives that could cripple Germany's capacity to continue the war. His reconnaissance units reported that German forces in front of him were in complete disarray, that the vaunted Wehrmacht was in headlong retreat with minimal ability to defend. Given adequate fuel, Patton believed he could drive deep into Germany before winter. possibly forcing a German collapse, months ahead of what actually occurred. The fuel shortage was not merely inconvenient. It was, in his view, prolonging the war and costing Allied lives. The impossible nature of Patton's equation stemmed from multiple competing factors that could not be simultaneously satisfied. Supreme Headquarters wanted to advance on a broad front, with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group pushing through Belgium toward the Ruhr, while American forces advanced through central France. This strategy distributed limited fuel supplies among multiple armies, ensuring no single commander received everything he requested. Patton argued vehemently for a concentrated thrust, insisting that giving him priority for fuel would allow a decisive breakthrough, but Eisenhower and his staff feared that a narrow advance would create vulnerable flanks and logistics that could be cut. The strategic debate was really about which logistical approach could be sustained: a broad advance with everyone operating at reduced capacity, or a concentrated thrust with one army receiving abundant supply while others paused. Port capacity formed another immovable variable in Patton's equation. The Allied logistical system remained dependent on Normandy beaches and Cherbourg through August and September, desperately inadequate for supporting armies that were now hundreds of miles away. The major port of Antwerp was captured by British forces in early September, but its approaches remained in German hands, preventing its use. Until Antwerp became operational in late November, the supply system functioned at perhaps 60% of what advancing armies actually needed. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration had to travel through this bottleneck. Patton could rage against fuel allocations, but ultimately, the physical infrastructure could only deliver so much, regardless of how priorities were arranged. The fuel pipeline project represented an attempt to solve the equation through engineering. The Red Ball Express, while heroic, was inherently inefficient. Trucks consumed roughly a third of the fuel they transported on long hauls. Engineers proposed building a pipeline from Normandy to forward areas, allowing fuel to flow continuously without consuming itself in transport. This solution was technically sound, but temporally impossible for Patton's immediate needs. Pipeline construction required months of work, thousands of tons of specialized equipment, and significant labor resources. The pipeline would eventually be built and would transform supply efficiency, but it offered no solution to the crisis Patton faced in August and September of 1944. He needed fuel now, measured in hours and days, while engineering solutions operated on timescales of weeks and months. Patton's personality intensified the fuel crisis into a personal obsession that sometimes bordered on insubordination. He was temperamentally incapable of accepting logistical constraints as legitimate limitations. His entire military philosophy centered on aggressive action, maintaining momentum, and exploiting enemy weakness without hesitation. When told that fuel shortages required halting his advance, he perceived not logistical reality, but failure of will and imagination. Patton diverted fuel from other units, manipulated supply requisitions, understated his actual fuel consumption to headquarters while overstating it to supply officers, and generally treated the logistics system as an obstacle to be overcome through cunning, rather than a framework within which operations must function. His supply officers performed miracles of improvisation, but even their creativity could not manufacture fuel that did not exist. The strategic implications of Patton's fuel problem extended far beyond his own frustration. In early September, Montgomery proposed Operation Market Garden, an ambitious airborne assault to seize bridges across the Rhine in Holland. This operation received priority for supplies, including fuel that might otherwise have gone to Patton. Market Garden ultimately failed, and historians have debated ever since whether giving those resources to Patton instead would have produced better results. The counterfactual is impossible to prove, but it illustrates how fuel allocation became a strategic choice with profound consequences. Someone would be fuel-starved. The question was, who could best use limited resources? Eisenhower chose to support Montgomery's calculated risk rather than Patton's aggressive pursuit, a decision that Patton never forgave. The human cost of the fuel equation added moral weight to what might otherwise seem like mere logistics. Every day, Patton's tanks sat immobile. For lack of fuel was another day that concentration camps continued operating, that occupied populations remained under Nazi control, that the Wehrmacht had time to conscript another generation of German teenagers. Patton felt this urgency viscerally. He believed that rapid victory would ultimately save lives by ending the war sooner, even if his aggressive tactics produced higher casualties in the short term. The logisticians who constrained his fuel saw different calculations. Armies that outran their supplies became vulnerable to counterattack, and a defeated or encircled army would cost far more lives than a delayed advance. Both perspectives contained truth, but they were fundamentally incommensurable, different ways of calculating human cost that could not be reconciled through logic alone. Weather and terrain added additional variables to the impossible equation. As summer turned to autumn, rains began turning French and German roads into mud, increasing vehicle fuel consumption and slowing convoy speeds. The approach of winter meant reduced daylight hours for operations and worse conditions for soldiers living in the field. Patton could feel the operational window closing, sensing that once winter arrived in force, mobile warfare would become impossible and the war would settle into static grinding similar to World War I. His desperation for fuel reflected his awareness that time itself was running out, that the unique opportunity created by the Normandy breakout would not recur. The eventual resolution of Patton's fuel crisis came not through solving the equation, but through changing its parameters. As autumn progressed, the port of Antwerp finally opened, dramatically increasing supply capacity. The Red Ball Express was supplemented by rail lines being repaired behind the advancing armies, improving transport efficiency. The front lines stabilized as German resistance stiffened near their own borders, reducing the rate of advance and thus fuel consumption. By December, fuel was flowing adequately to support operations, though by then the operational situation had fundamentally changed. The desperate German Ardennes offensive in December would disrupt supply lines again, but in a context of defensive rather than offensive operations. Patton's fuel problem ultimately revealed the central paradox of mechanized warfare. Mobility created by gasoline engines was simultaneously enabled and constrained by the need for continuous fuel supply. Tanks could move 50 miles in a day, but only if fuel could be delivered 50 miles forward, which became progressively harder as the distance from supply bases increased. The very speed that made armor revolutionary also made it logistically vulnerable. Patton understood armored warfare's tactical and operational dimensions brilliantly, but he never fully accepted its logistical limitations as anything other than failures of imagination by lesser men. His fuel crisis was not truly impossible. It was solved eventually, but it was impossible to solve on his timeline using available resources while simultaneously supporting other Allied armies. The equation had no solution that satisfied all variables simultaneously, forcing commanders to choose which factors to prioritize. Those choices shaped not just Patton's advance, but the entire conclusion of the European war, demonstrating that even the most brilliant tactical commander remains constrained by the mundane realities of fuel, transport, and supply. A radical solution: birth of the Red Ball Express. In August of 1944, Allied logisticians faced a crisis that threatened to derail the entire liberation of France and potentially extend World War II by months or even years. American armies had broken out from Normandy and were racing across France faster than anyone had anticipated, liberating hundreds of square miles daily and destroying German forces that could not retreat quickly enough. This stunning success created an impossible supply problem. The advancing armies were consuming fuel, ammunition, and supplies at astronomical rates, while simultaneously moving farther from the Normandy ports where those supplies were being landed. Traditional supply methods were failing catastrophically, with frontline units literally running out of fuel mid-advance, while depots in Normandy overflowed with supplies that could not be moved forward fast enough. The gap between supply and demand was widening every day, threatening to stop the Allied advance dead and give the Germans precious time to reorganize. What emerged from this crisis was one of the most audacious logistical improvisations in military history: the Red Ball Express, a radical convoy system that would revolutionize how armies thought about rapid supply delivery under emergency conditions. The Red Ball Express was born from desperate necessity rather than careful planning. No military manual described such a system, and no peacetime logistics officer would have designed anything remotely similar. The concept violated established transportation doctrine in almost every regard, prioritizing speed and volume over efficiency and sustainability. Traditional military supply doctrine emphasized maintaining distributed supply depots at various echelons, moving supplies forward in carefully planned increments, and ensuring that transport assets were used efficiently with minimal waste. The Red Ball Express threw all of this away in favor of a simple, almost brutal concept: dedicate thousands of trucks to running continuously in a one-way loop from supply depots in Normandy to forward distribution points hundreds of miles away, moving as fast as possible regardless of cost or inefficiency. Until the crisis was resolved, it was logistics as emergency medicine, a trauma response rather than preventive care. The name itself came from railroad terminology, where Red Ball freight designated high-priority cargo that received right-of-way over all other traffic. This linguistic choice revealed the system's core philosophy. Supply trucks would have absolute priority on designated routes, and everything else had to yield. In practice, this meant that specific highways were closed to all military traffic except Red Ball convoys, that military police controlled every intersection to ensure smooth flow, and that broken-down vehicles were immediately pushed off the road rather than blocking traffic while being repaired. The system required commandeering significant portions of France's limited functioning road network, effectively reserving them exclusively for supply runs. This was logistical totalitarianism applied to transportation, and it worked precisely because it was so ruthlessly single-minded. The scale of the Red Ball Express was staggering, even by the standards of American wartime logistics. At its peak in late August and early September, the system employed nearly 6,000 trucks, organized into dozens of truck companies. These vehicles ran 24 hours per day in continuous rotation, with drivers working shifts that would have been illegal in peacetime and dangerous under any circumstances. Each truck was loaded with 5 to 10 tons of supplies, typically fuel in jerry cans, ammunition, or rations, whatever the forward units needed most desperately at that moment. The round trip from Normandy to forward supply points near the front could exceed 700 miles, taking multiple days to complete when accounting for loading, unloading, and the return journey. Simple mathematics revealed the system's audacity. 6,000 trucks, each making round trips of several hundred miles, meant that tens of thousands of vehicle miles were being driven daily, consuming massive quantities of fuel simply to deliver fuel and other supplies forward. The human dimension of the Red Ball Express has become inseparable from its historical significance, particularly regarding race and military service. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers were African American soldiers serving in segregated transportation units. The United States military in 1944 remained thoroughly segregated, with black soldiers largely relegated to support roles rather than combat positions. The Red Ball Express became one of the few places where African American soldiers played a visibly critical role in winning the war. These men drove through the night on unfamiliar roads, through territory recently occupied by Germans, where bypassed enemy units sometimes remained. Under constant pressure to deliver supplies faster, they slept in their trucks or in improvised roadside camps, ate while driving, and pushed their vehicles to speeds that caused frequent mechanical failures. Their contribution was essential to Allied victory in France. Yet the racial dynamics of wartime America meant they received far less recognition than their white counterparts in combat units. The operational challenges of running the Red Ball Express were immense and multiplied with every day the system continued. Driver fatigue became severe as the crisis stretched from days into weeks and then months. Men were driving marathon shifts with minimal rest, and accidents inevitably increased. Trucks broke down constantly under the strain of continuous operation over roads damaged by years of war. The French highway system, never designed for such intensive use, began deteriorating rapidly under the pounding of thousands of heavy vehicles. Maintenance facilities were overwhelmed trying to keep trucks running, and the supply chain for spare parts struggled to keep pace with the rate of mechanical failures. The system was literally consuming itself, wearing out trucks and roads faster than they could be repaired, but stopping it meant stopping the advance. Fuel consumption by the Red Ball Express itself became a dark irony embedded in the system's mathematics. Trucks consumed approximately 1 gallon of fuel for every 6 miles traveled when fully loaded, meaning that a truck making a 700-mile round trip would burn more than 100 gallons of fuel. If that truck was carrying fuel in jerry cans, it might transport perhaps 2,000 gallons in a load, meaning that roughly 5% of transported fuel was being consumed by the transport process itself. This ratio worsened as distances increased and as mechanical problems forced trucks to travel slower or make multiple attempts to reach forward areas. Logisticians were acutely aware that they were burning fuel to deliver fuel, an inherently inefficient process, but they had no alternative. The only ways to improve this ratio were to shorten the distances, which required capturing more forward ports, or to build pipelines, which required time that commanders did not have. The impact of the Red Ball Express on the broader Allied campaign was paradoxical and multifaceted. On one hand, it succeeded brilliantly at its immediate mission, keeping the advance moving when traditional supply methods had failed. Third Army's Patton, First Army's Hodges, and other commanders received enough fuel and ammunition to maintain offensive pressure on the Germans through August and September, liberating vast areas of France and Belgium. Without the Red Ball Express, the Allied advance would have ground to a halt somewhere in central France, giving the Germans weeks to establish new defensive lines and potentially changing the entire trajectory of the war's final year. The system delivered approximately 12,000 tons of supplies daily at its peak, a staggering achievement that demonstrated what could be accomplished through sheer determination and willingness to accept inefficiency in pursuit of urgent objectives. On the other hand, the Red Ball Express was unsustainable as anything other than a temporary emergency measure. The system was destroying trucks faster than they could be replaced, exhausting drivers beyond reasonable limits, and consuming enormous quantities of fuel in the transportation process itself. Had the war continued at the same operational tempo indefinitely, the Red Ball Express would have collapsed from sheer mechanical and human exhaustion. It was a sprint being run at marathon distance, and everyone involved knew that something had to change. The long-term solution required capturing the port of Antwerp and bringing it into operation, building rail connections forward to reduce reliance on trucks, and constructing fuel pipelines to improve transport efficiency. These projects were all underway, but they required weeks or months to complete, and the Red Ball Express had to bridge that gap regardless of cost. The social dynamics within Red Ball truck companies revealed both the potential and limitations of military integration under pressure. White and black soldiers worked alongside each other in conditions that sometimes broke down racial barriers through shared hardship, yet segregation remained official policy. African American drivers proved themselves as capable and courageous as any soldiers in the army, directly contradicting the racist assumptions that justified segregation, but institutional change came slowly. Some white officers who commanded black truck companies developed genuine respect for their men and advocated for their recognition, while others maintained the prejudices of the era. The Red Ball Express became a source of pride within black communities and among civil rights advocates, as evidence that African Americans could perform critical military missions when given the opportunity, feeding into broader arguments for military integration that would eventually succeed several years after the war ended. The tactical innovations developed by Red Ball drivers and their officers emerged from necessity and contributed to post-war logistics doctrine. Convoy procedures were refined through constant practice, with standardized spacing between vehicles, protocols for handling breakdowns, and communication systems that allowed convoys to maintain cohesion across hundreds of miles. Maintenance procedures evolved to emphasize quick fixes that kept trucks running, rather than thorough repairs that removed vehicles from service for extended periods. Loading and unloading techniques were streamlined to minimize turnaround time at each end of the route. These practices, developed under emergency conditions, were studied after the war and influenced how the American military approached logistics in subsequent conflicts. The infrastructure supporting the Red Ball Express expanded into a comprehensive system that encompassed far more than just trucks and drivers. Military police units were dedicated to traffic control along Red Ball routes, managing intersections and ensuring that priority convoys could pass without delay. Maintenance battalions established repair facilities along the routes, ready to fix common mechanical problems quickly. Medical units provided aid stations for drivers who were injured or became ill on the road. Communications teams maintained telephone and radio links that allowed coordination between supply depots, convoy commanders, and forward units requesting supplies. This supporting infrastructure represented a massive investment of military resources, justified only by the criticality of maintaining supply flow during the crisis period. Weather and seasonal change posed increasing challenges as the Red Ball Express continued into autumn. Summer roads that had been passable became muddy quagmires as autumn rains arrived, slowing convoys and increasing fuel consumption. Shorter daylight hours complicated operations, though most driving occurred at night anyway, to avoid potential German air attacks and to exploit cooler temperatures that reduced engine strain. The approach of winter threatened to make some routes impassable and raised concerns about how the system would function in snow and ice. These environmental factors added urgency to efforts to bring forward ports into operation and reduce reliance on long-haul trucking. The eventual phase-out of the Red Ball Express, beginning in November 1944, marked not failure, but success in achieving its temporary mission. As the port of Antwerp came into operation and rail connections were restored closer to the front lines, the need for extreme long-haul trucking diminished. Trucks could return to more traditional distribution roles, moving supplies shorter distances from railheads or ports to forward units. The official conclusion of Red Ball operations allowed much-needed maintenance on vehicles that had been run into the ground and gave exhausted drivers opportunities for rest and recovery. The system had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do: bridge a critical gap between the pace of operational success and the development of sustainable logistics infrastructure. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extends far beyond its immediate impact on the 1944 campaign. It demonstrated that traditional logistics doctrine could be successfully violated when circumstances demanded radical solutions, that inefficiency was acceptable when speed was essential, and that properly motivated soldiers could sustain superhuman efforts when they understood the stakes. The experience influenced American military logistics throughout the Cold War and beyond, providing a case study in emergency supply operations that was studied by logistics officers for generations. Perhaps most importantly, it showed that African American soldiers could perform critical missions superbly when given the chance, contributing to the eventual integration of the United States military and serving as a symbol of Black Americans' contributions to victory in World War II. The army that ran on courage and gasoline. The American military forces that swept across Western Europe from June 1944 to May 1945 embodied a unique fusion of industrial might and human determination that had never before existed in military history. This was an army fundamentally different from all previous fighting forces, one that depended absolutely on vast quantities of petroleum products, while simultaneously requiring extraordinary personal courage from the soldiers who operated its machines. The phrase captures a profound truth about modern mechanized warfare. All the gasoline in the world meant nothing without brave men willing to drive tanks into enemy fire, fly aircraft through anti-aircraft barrages, and advance under artillery bombardment. Yet all the courage in the world could not move armies forward without the fuel to power their vehicles. This interdependence between material resources and human spirit defined the American way of war and revealed both the possibilities and paradoxes of industrial age combat. Understanding the American army as one that ran on courage and gasoline requires first comprehending the sheer scale of petroleum consumption involved in mechanized warfare. The United States fielded approximately 8 million personnel in its armed forces by 1945, supported by the most mechanized military in history. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which still relied heavily on horses for transport, or the Red Army, which depended significantly on foot mobility, the American military moved almost exclusively by motor vehicle. Every infantry division contained hundreds of trucks, jeeps, and specialized vehicles. Armored divisions possessed tanks, half-tracks, self-propelled artillery, and armored cars. Support units operated thousands of additional vehicles for supply, maintenance, medical services, and command functions. Each of these vehicles required gasoline or diesel fuel, and their consumption was staggering by any previous standard. A single armored division conducting offensive operations could consume over 100,000 gallons of fuel daily. When multiple divisions operated simultaneously across a theater, daily fuel requirements reached millions of gallons. The 3rd Army under Patton alone consumed approximately 400,000 gallons on an average day, rising to 800,000 during intense operations. These numbers represented only combat units. The supply system supporting them consumed vast additional quantities, moving fuel forward. As trucks burned fuel to deliver fuel in a cascading chain extending back to ports and refineries, the scale was so enormous that it challenged comprehension even for the logisticians managing it. Never before had human warfare consumed natural resources at such rates, and the American military's ability to sustain this consumption across multiple theaters simultaneously demonstrated industrial capacity that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. Yet gasoline alone could not win battles, and the American soldiers' courage under fire remained as essential as in any previous war. The young men crewing Sherman tanks knew they were operating vehicles that were mechanically reliable and numerically superior, but individually inferior to German Panthers and Tigers in armor protection and firepower. A Sherman's armor could be penetrated by German guns at ranges where American guns could not reliably destroy German tanks. Sherman crews called their vehicles Ronsons after a lighter brand, because they had a terrible tendency to catch fire when hit, incinerating the men inside. Despite knowing these grim statistics, American tankers climbed into their Shermans every morning and advanced against enemy positions because their courage compelled them forward. They understood that their tactical doctrine emphasized using numerical superiority and combined arms coordination to overcome individual vehicle deficiencies, but that understanding did not eliminate the fear of burning to death inside a steel coffin. The infantrymen who fought alongside and sometimes ahead of the tanks faced their own terrible realities. They advanced into machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and minefields, knowing that their individual chances of survival were matters of luck as much as skill. The American infantry was better supplied than any fighting force in history, with excellent weapons, abundant ammunition, regular food, and superior medical care. Yet these advantages could not eliminate the fundamental horror of combat. German defensive positions were expertly constructed. Their soldiers were experienced and determined, and breaking through required American infantrymen to expose themselves to fire repeatedly. The courage required to stand up and move forward, when every instinct screamed to stay down and hide, was no less than that required of soldiers throughout history, regardless of how much gasoline powered the trucks that brought them to battle. The synergy between material abundance and fighting spirit created operational capabilities that overwhelmed German defenders. American units that suffered casualties could be reinforced and re-equipped rapidly, maintaining combat effectiveness that German units could not match. When an American tank was destroyed, another appeared to replace it, often within days. When infantry companies suffered losses, replacement soldiers arrived to maintain unit strength. This capacity for regeneration depended on gasoline-powered supply systems delivering men and material forward continuously. But it also depended on soldiers willing to be those replacements, knowing they were joining units that had just suffered casualties and would likely face similar dangers. The courage to volunteer for hazardous duty or accept dangerous assignments was multiplied exponentially by industrial capacity, creating an army that could sustain offensive pressure indefinitely. The air war above Europe demonstrated the relationship between fuel and courage with particular clarity. American bombers flew deep into German territory in broad daylight, facing anti-aircraft fire and intercepting fighters that killed aircrews at horrific rates. During certain periods of the strategic bombing campaign, the statistical probability of an American bomber crewman surviving his required tour of 25 missions was well below 50%. These men knew the statistics, understood the risks, and climbed into their aircraft anyway because they believed in their mission and possessed the courage to face death repeatedly. Their aircraft required thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel for each mission, fuel that had to be shipped across the Atlantic, delivered to bases in England, and pumped into tanks before every flight. Without fuel, the most courageous crew could not fly. Yet without courageous crews, all the fuel in the world could not strike German targets. Fighter pilots escorting bombers or conducting ground attack missions faced different but equally lethal dangers. They operated at the edge of their aircraft's range, knowing that fuel limitations meant they could not linger long over target areas before having to turn back. Combat with German fighters consumed fuel rapidly as pilots used full throttle for maneuvers, and getting lost or damaged could mean running out of fuel before reaching friendly territory. Pilots had to balance aggressive tactics against fuel management, requiring both courage to engage enemy aircraft and discipline to preserve enough fuel for the return flight. The calculation was brutally simple: too cautious, and they failed their mission; too aggressive, and they died when their engines quit over enemy territory. The fusion of technical skill, tactical judgment, and raw courage under these conditions separated effective fighter pilots from those who did not survive. The naval war in the Atlantic and Pacific demonstrated the same interdependence on an even larger scale. American warships were floating cities powered by fuel oil, capable of projecting power across entire oceans, but dependent on continuous refueling to maintain operations. The Pacific theater particularly showcased this dynamic, where American carrier task forces operated thousands of miles from the nearest friendly port, sustained by fleet oilers that delivered fuel at sea. The sailors operating these ships faced kamikaze attacks, submarine threats, and the ordinary dangers of operating complex machinery in a hostile environment. Their courage was quieter than infantrymen charging machine gun nests, but no less real. The firemen who worked in engineering spaces deep in the hull knew they were in the most dangerous location if the ship was torpedoed. Yet they maintained the boilers and engines that powered the fleet. The relationship between courage and gasoline was not simply additive, but multiplicative. Gasoline enabled tactics that would have been impossible in previous wars, allowing forces to maneuver rapidly, concentrate overwhelming force at decisive points, and exploit success with deep penetrations. But these tactics only worked when soldiers executed them courageously despite the risks. Conversely, courage alone, without fuel, produced immobilized forces that could be destroyed by enemies who retained mobility. The Germans learned this lesson painfully during their final offensives, when units composed of fanatical soldiers willing to fight to the death were nonetheless defeated because they lacked fuel for their tanks and trucks. Courage could not substitute for gasoline, but gasoline could not substitute for courage either. The cultural dimensions of being an army that ran on courage and gasoline shaped American military identity in lasting ways. The emphasis on mechanical reliability and material abundance became defining characteristics of American military culture, distinguishing it from the improvisation and austerity that characterized other armies. American soldiers expected their equipment to work, their supplies to arrive, and their support systems to function. When these expectations were met, as they usually were, morale remained high and combat effectiveness was sustained. When supply failures occurred, as during the fuel crisis of autumn 1944 or the desperate days of the Battle of the Bulge, American units responded with remarkable resilience, demonstrating that they had not become so dependent on material advantages that they could not function without them. The moral economy of this relationship between resources and courage contained inherent tensions. Some critics, both contemporary and historical, argued that American reliance on material superiority reflected a lack of martial spirit, that truly courageous armies should be willing to fight with minimal resources like the Germans or Japanese. This criticism fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of courage and the logic of industrial warfare. American soldiers were no less brave than their enemies, but American commanders chose to leverage industrial capacity to achieve objectives with fewer casualties when possible. Spending gasoline to save lives was not cowardice, but wisdom. Though it required different forms of courage than the fatalistic bravery that characterized armies with no alternative but human sacrifice, the logistical courage required to maintain fuel supplies was itself a form of bravery that rarely received adequate recognition. The merchant mariners who sailed tankers across submarine-infested Atlantic waters faced death rates comparable to combat soldiers. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express drove through the night in recently liberated territory where German stragglers remained active. The engineers who built fuel pipelines and storage facilities worked under occasional artillery fire and the constant risk of accidental explosions. These men were not carrying rifles into direct combat, but their courage under dangerous conditions was essential to keeping the gasoline flowing that allowed others to fight. The environmental and economic costs of an army running on gasoline were enormous, but largely invisible to contemporaries. Focused on winning the war, American petroleum production was mobilized completely for the war effort, with civilian consumption restricted through rationing. The quantities of fuel consumed by military operations represented a significant portion of total national production, and the infrastructure required to refine, transport, and distribute this fuel was itself a major industrial achievement. The carbon emissions and environmental impact were never considered because environmental consciousness did not yet exist in its modern form, but the sheer scale of combustion involved in mechanized warfare was historically unprecedented. The transition from wartime to peacetime operations revealed just how dependent the American military had become on abundant fuel supplies. Post-war planning had to account for maintaining massive petroleum stockpiles and supply systems even during peace, as the mobility and firepower that defined American military capability could not be sustained without them. The Cold War military that emerged from World War II was even more fuel-dependent than its wartime predecessor, with jet aircraft, nuclear-powered ships, and ever larger tank formations that consumed fuel at rates that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. The army that ran on courage and gasoline became a permanent fixture of American power projection. The human stories embedded in this larger narrative reveal the intimate reality of fighting in a mechanized army. Letters from soldiers to families often mentioned the contradictions: gratitude for hot meals, clean uniforms, and mechanical transport alongside descriptions of terror under fire. Tank crews developed deep bonds with their vehicles, giving them names and maintaining them obsessively because their lives depended on mechanical reliability. Infantry units developed complex relationships with supporting armor and artillery, grateful for firepower that saved lives, while sometimes resentful of resources devoted to machines rather than men. These human textures illustrated how courage and gasoline intertwined in daily experience, neither sufficient alone, but together, creating the force that liberated Europe. The ultimate achievement of the army that ran on courage and gasoline was proving that industrial societies could field military forces that combined technological sophistication with human virtues. The American military demonstrated that abundance did not produce weakness, that soldiers equipped with superior resources could fight as bravely as those with nothing to lose, and that the intelligent application of industrial capacity could reduce casualties while increasing effectiveness. This model would define American military power for generations, establishing expectations about how advanced democracies should wage war when their values demanded both achieving objectives and protecting their soldiers' lives as much as possible. Defying every rule of warfare. The Allied advance across Western Europe, from the Normandy beaches to the heart of Germany, represented a systematic violation of virtually every established principle of military doctrine that had governed warfare for centuries. Military academies from West Point to Saint-Cyr had taught generations of officers that armies must maintain secure supply lines, that forces should never advance faster than their logistics could support, that flanks must be protected before pressing forward, and that consolidation should follow every major victory. The campaigns of 1944 and 45 ignored or deliberately violated these rules with a frequency and audacity that should theoretically have resulted in disaster. Yet instead of the catastrophic defeats that classical military theory predicted, these violations produced the most successful offensive campaigns in modern military history. The American-led forces rewrote the rulebook of warfare not through theoretical innovation, but through practical demonstration that industrial capacity and operational audacity could transcend limitations that previous generations had considered immutable laws of war. The most fundamental rule being violated was the classical principle of maintaining lines of communication. Since ancient times, military theorists had emphasized that armies required secure routes back to their bases for supply, reinforcement, and retreat if necessary. An army that advanced so far that its supply lines could be cut was inviting destruction, as Napoleon discovered in Russia, and countless other commanders learned through bitter experience. The Allied advance after the Normandy breakout flagrantly disregarded this wisdom. Patton's Third Army raced across France so rapidly that it created a supply line stretching hundreds of miles through recently liberated territory, where German stragglers, bypassed units, and resistance fighters all operated. At various points, the distance from frontline units to supply depots exceeded 400 miles of vulnerable road network. Classical doctrine would have demanded pausing to consolidate, establishing intermediate supply bases, and ensuring rear area security before advancing further. Instead, commanders pushed forward relentlessly, gambling that speed would prevent the Germans from organizing effective counterattacks against extended supply lines. This gamble succeeded partly because of another rule violation: the doctrine of balanced advance on a broad front. Traditional military wisdom held that armies should advance uniformly, maintaining contact between adjacent units and avoiding creating salients that could be attacked from multiple directions. The Allied advance created exactly such salients repeatedly, with armored spearheads pushing deep into enemy territory while infantry units struggled to keep pace and secure the flanks. At various times, Patton's armor had advanced so far ahead of supporting infantry that gaps of 20 or 30 miles existed between units, creating opportunities for German forces to infiltrate or counterattack. Military theory predicted disaster from such dispositions, yet the disasters rarely materialized because the Germans lacked the resources to exploit these opportunities effectively. The Allies were violating rules in a context where their enemy was too weak to punish those violations. But this was itself a calculated risk that flew in the face of conservative military planning. The principle of concentration of force, one of the most fundamental concepts in military strategy, was simultaneously honored and violated in paradoxical ways. Classical doctrine taught that forces should be concentrated at the decisive point, creating overwhelming superiority that ensured victory. The Allied approach concentrated forces logistically while dispersing them operationally, maintaining multiple simultaneous offensives across a front stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland. This dispersion meant that no single thrust received overwhelming resources, frustrating commanders like Patton, who believed a concentrated attack in one sector could have achieved decisive breakthrough. Yet the dispersion also prevented the Germans from concentrating their own limited resources, forcing them to defend everywhere and achieve superiority nowhere. This violated the principle of concentration in its classical form, while achieving a broader strategic concentration that overwhelmed German capacity to respond. The temporal dimension of the Allied advance defied traditional operational rhythms that military theorists had long considered necessary. Armies throughout history had operated in cycles of advance, consolidation, resupply, and renewed advance. Each offensive phase was followed by a pause to absorb replacements, repair equipment, stockpile supplies, and prepare for the next operation. The Allied forces attempted to maintain continuous offensive pressure without these pauses, pushing exhausted units to continue attacking even when commanders recognized that effectiveness was declining. Soldiers fought for weeks without rest. Equipment was used until it broke down rather than being maintained preventively, and supplies were consumed as fast as they arrived rather than being stockpiled for future operations. This approach defied the physiological and mechanical realities that had always imposed operational pauses, and it worked only because the industrial base could replace worn-out men and equipment faster than they were consumed. The logistical assumptions underlying traditional warfare were violated so completely that observers struggled to comprehend what was happening. Classical military theory assumed that armies consumed supplies roughly proportional to their size, that wastage should be minimized to extend operational reach, and that efficiency was a cardinal virtue in logistics. The American supply system violated all of this by delivering supplies in quantities far exceeding immediate needs, accepting enormous waste as the price of ensuring that shortages never constrained operations. Artillery units fired ammunition at rates that would have bankrupted 18th or 19th century armies within days. Infantry units discarded damaged equipment rather than repairing it because replacements were readily available. The Red Ball Express burned fuel to deliver fuel at ratios that traditional logisticians considered insane. This prodigal approach to supply made sense only in a context of industrial abundance so complete that waste was cheaper than the operational delays that conservation would impose. The doctrine of preserving combat power, which taught that forces should be husbanded carefully and not expended unnecessarily, was selectively ignored when operational objectives demanded aggressive action. American commanders accepted casualty rates that would have seemed reckless by the standards of earlier wars, though still far lower than what other armies were suffering. Infantry units that had been reduced to 60 or 70% strength continued attacking rather than being pulled back for reconstitution. Tank companies that had lost half their vehicles remained in the line. The traditional military calculus that units should be withdrawn when they fell below certain effectiveness thresholds was overridden by the operational imperative of maintaining pressure and the logistical reality that replacements would arrive to restore strength eventually. This approach was sustainable only because the replacement system could deliver fresh soldiers and equipment continuously, violating the traditional assumption that combat power once expended was difficult to regenerate. The principle of unity of command, which military theorists had preached since ancient times, was honored more in theory than practice during the Allied campaigns. The command structure was Byzantine in its complexity, with American generals reporting to Eisenhower, who had to balance American national interests against maintaining alliance cohesion with the British. Montgomery and Patton pursued their own operational visions with minimal coordination and considerable mutual hostility. Supply allocations were determined through negotiation and political maneuvering as much as rational planning. The French forces operated with significant autonomy, despite being equipped and supplied by the Americans. This fragmented command structure should theoretically have produced incoherence and failed offensives, yet the sheer material superiority and competence of subordinate commanders allowed success despite coordination failures that would have doomed less well-resourced armies. The vulnerability of supply lines to interdiction was another area where the Allies violated conventional wisdom with impunity. Traditional doctrine held that armies operating far from their bases were vulnerable to having their supply lines cut by enemy action. The Allied supply system depended on roads and railways that were theoretically vulnerable to German attack at numerous points. The Red Ball Express in particular operated convoys on predictable routes that German aircraft or ground forces could have attacked devastatingly. Yet such attacks rarely occurred because Allied air superiority was so complete that German forces could barely move in daylight, much less organize effective raids against supply routes. The Allies were violating the rule about supply line security, not through superior protective measures, but by achieving such dominance that the theoretical vulnerability never materialized into actual danger. The seasonal campaigning restrictions that had governed warfare throughout history were challenged, though not entirely overcome. Armies traditionally sought to conclude campaigns before winter, recognizing that cold weather imposed severe hardships on soldiers and made mobile operations difficult. The Allied command structure debated whether to pause operations during winter 1944-45 or continue offensive pressure despite the weather. The decision to maintain pressure defied the traditional wisdom of winter quarters, though the subsequent difficulties during the Battle of the Bulge and other winter operations validated some of the classical caution about winter campaigning. This represented a partial rather than complete violation of traditional rules, acknowledging that industrial armies could fight through winter but could not entirely escape the constraints that weather imposed. The principle of fighting on favorable terrain and avoiding disadvantageous ground was frequently violated by operational necessity. Infantry units assaulted fortified positions on hilltops, advanced through dense forests that negated their advantages in armor and artillery, and attacked across rivers despite the obvious defensive advantages such obstacles provided defenders. Classical doctrine would have counseled maneuvering to force enemies out of strong positions rather than attacking them directly. But the operational situation often demanded direct assault. The ability to violate this rule successfully depended on overwhelming firepower and numerical superiority that could overcome terrain disadvantages, luxuries that few armies in history had possessed. The traditional emphasis on operational security and deception was observed inconsistently, with the Allies sometimes operating with a transparency that would have horrified earlier commanders. Radio communications were extensive and sometimes inadequately encrypted. Troop movements occurred on such large scales that concealment was impossible, and operational plans were discussed at echelons where leaks were likely. Yet this violation of security doctrine mattered less than it should have, because German intelligence was so degraded and their capacity to respond so limited that knowing Allied intentions did not enable effective countermeasures. The Allies could afford to be less secretive than classical doctrine demanded because they were strong enough that even forewarned enemies could not stop them. The moral and psychological rules of warfare were tested by the industrial scale of combat. Traditional military culture had emphasized honor, individual heroism, and the decisive engagement where superior generalship and fighting spirit determined outcomes. The industrial warfare of 1944 and 45 reduced individual soldiers to interchangeable parts in a vast machine where personal courage mattered but could not overcome systematic material inferiority. German soldiers often fought with suicidal bravery, but were overwhelmed by opponents who could afford to use firepower lavishly to minimize their own casualties. This violated romantic conceptions of warfare as a test of character and revealed it as ultimately a contest of industrial production and logistical organization. The final rule violation was perhaps the most profound: the assumption that wars were won primarily through superior strategy and generalship. The Allied victory in Western Europe demonstrated that while competent leadership certainly mattered, the decisive factor was industrial capacity that enabled violating traditional constraints with impunity. Mediocre generals commanding the American army would still have won because the material advantages were so overwhelming, though the war might have lasted longer and cost more lives. This realization was disturbing to military professionals who had spent careers studying the art of war, suggesting that their expertise was less important than the output of factories and refineries. The Allies were defying not just specific rules, but the entire classical understanding of warfare as a domain where human genius and martial virtue were the primary determinants of success. The long-term implications of these rule violations reshaped how modern militaries understood warfare. The campaigns of 1944 and 45 established that industrial democracies with massive productive capacity could wage war in ways that violated traditional constraints, accepting inefficiencies and risks that less wealthy nations could not afford. This model worked brilliantly against Germany, but contained assumptions about resource availability and industrial superiority that might not apply in different contexts. Later conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere would reveal that some traditional rules retained validity, even for industrial armies, that speed and firepower could not always substitute for patience and economy, and that defying every rule of warfare worked primarily when fighting enemies who lacked the capacity to exploit the vulnerabilities such defiance created. German shock and psychological collapse. The German military and civilian leadership experienced a form of cognitive dissonance so profound during the final year of World War II that it fundamentally altered their capacity for rational decision-making and precipitated a perseverance of marketed taxed psychological collapse that extended from the highest levels of command down to individual soldiers in the field. This mental breakdown was not merely a response to impending defeat, which many armies throughout history have faced with continued discipline and coherent resistance, but rather stemmed from the complete invalidation of assumptions that had underpinned German military thinking for generations. The Wehrmacht had entered the war confident in its tactical superiority, operational excellence, and the fighting spirit of German soldiers as decisive advantages that could overcome material deficiencies. The encounter with American logistics shattered these assumptions so completely that many German officers and soldiers simply could not process what they were witnessing. The resulting psychological crisis manifested in denial, magical thinking, internal recriminations, and ultimately a brittle fatalism that accelerated Germany's military collapse even beyond what purely material factors would have dictated. The initial shock began during the Normandy campaign, but intensified exponentially as Allied forces broke out and raced across France in August of 1944. German commanders had expected a grinding battle of attrition in which their tactical expertise and defensive skill would inflict unsustainable casualties on Allied forces, potentially leading to a negotiated settlement. Instead, they watched their carefully prepared defensive positions simply bypassed by American armor that moved so rapidly that traditional defensive concepts became irrelevant. Officers who had spent careers mastering the art of defensive warfare discovered that their expertise meant nothing when the enemy could advance 50 miles in a day, turning defensive positions into death traps for the units occupying them. The psychological impact of professional obsolescence was devastating, For men who had defined themselves through military competence, the encounter with American material abundance produced reactions that ranged from disbelief to despair among German soldiers. Prisoners taken during the campaigns consistently reported shock at the quantities of equipment and supplies that American units possessed. German soldiers who had spent years making do with inadequate rations, worn-out uniforms, and carefully conserved ammunition captured American supply dumps and found luxuries they had not seen since peacetime: coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, fresh clothing, and ammunition stacked in quantities that seemed impossible. Some German prisoners initially refused to believe they were seeing normal American supply levels, insisting that they must have captured a special depot or that the abundance was staged for propaganda purposes. The cognitive dissonance of fighting an enemy so wealthy that ordinary soldiers ate better than German officers was psychologically corrosive. The Luftwaffe's experience epitomized the psychological dimension of material inferiority. German pilots, who had once commanded European skies, found themselves utterly overwhelmed by American air power. The numbers were staggering and demoralizing. For every German aircraft that managed to take off, dozens of American planes filled the sky. German pilots described the psychological horror of seeing formations of hundreds of bombers protected by swarms of fighters, knowing that their own handful of interceptors could not meaningfully affect such armadas. Many experienced pilots simply refused to fly after watching their squadrons decimated repeatedly, not from cowardice, but from the psychological impossibility of continuing a mission that had become pure suicide. The Luftwaffe's command structure tried to maintain morale through propaganda about wonder weapons and strategic breakthroughs, but pilots who had watched their comrades die in hopeless battles could not sustain belief in ultimate victory. German intelligence services experienced their own form of psychological breakdown as they attempted to make sense of Allied capabilities. Reports from the field describing American logistical capacity were so far beyond German experience that intelligence analysts suspected exaggeration or deception when reconnaissance confirmed that American armies were indeed receiving supplies at rates 10 or 20 times what German forces could manage. Analysts struggled to incorporate this information into coherent assessments. Some reports were simply filed as implausible, while others generated recommendations so pessimistic that senior commanders rejected them as defeatist. The institutional culture of German intelligence could not adapt quickly enough to the reality of fighting an enemy whose capabilities exceeded the theoretical frameworks that intelligence officers used to evaluate military power. The psychological impact on senior German commanders manifested in increasingly detached and fantastical planning. Hitler's insistence on holding every position and refusing all withdrawals reflected partly ideological fanaticism, but also psychological inability to accept the implications of material inferiority. Field marshals who understood intellectually that their forces could not stop the Allied advance nonetheless issued orders for counterattacks and defensive stands that had no realistic chance of success. These orders served psychological rather than military functions, maintaining the fiction that German command still controlled events rather than merely reacting to them. The alternative, acknowledging that the war was lost and that continued resistance only increased German suffering, was psychologically intolerable for men who had invested their identities in German military supremacy. Junior officers and enlisted soldiers developed their own psychological coping mechanisms as the gap between official propaganda and battlefield reality became undeniable. Some retreated into fatalism, continuing to fight competently but without hope or belief in victory, simply because military discipline and unit cohesion provided structure amid chaos. Others embraced increasingly mystical beliefs in wonder weapons or political developments that would somehow reverse Germany's fortunes, despite all evidence to the contrary. The V-2 rockets and jet aircraft that did appear in limited numbers provided temporary psychological relief, evidence that German technical ingenuity had not entirely failed, but the quantities were too small to affect outcomes, and the relief quickly faded into renewed despair. The experience of being subjected to Allied firepower created psychological trauma distinct from the fear that soldiers in all wars experience. German veterans described the helplessness of enduring American artillery bombardments that seemed to have unlimited ammunition, firing for hours, without pause, in ways that German artillery could never match. The psychological impact of such barrages extended beyond their actual destructive effect, creating a sense that resistance was futile against an enemy who could expend shells as casually as German forces rationed them. Soldiers emerged from bombardments physically intact but mentally shattered, having spent hours in the knowledge that the enemy could continue the barrage indefinitely, while German counter-battery fire was constrained by ammunition shortages. The collapse of German logistics fed a vicious cycle of psychological deterioration. As supply systems failed, soldiers became increasingly desperate, scrounging for food and ammunition while watching American forces operate with evident abundance. The contrast was not merely demoralizing, but cognitively destabilizing, forcing German soldiers to confront the reality that their leaders had lied about American weakness, and that the war had perhaps always been unwinnable once the United States fully mobilized. This realization delegitimized the entire German war effort retrospectively, raising unbearable questions about why soldiers had sacrificed so much for a cause that was doomed from the start. Many soldiers could not psychologically integrate these questions and instead compartmentalized, focusing narrowly on immediate survival rather than the larger meaning of their situation. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented Germany's last major offensive and illustrated how psychological factors complicated military operations even when material resources were temporarily available. German forces achieved surprise and initial success, but soldiers who broke through American lines encountered supply dumps that confirmed everything they had heard about American abundance. The psychological impact of seeing such wealth, while knowing that German forces had scraped together fuel and ammunition for a single desperate offensive, was profoundly demoralizing. Many German soldiers who should have pressed their advantage instead paused to consume captured American rations and loot supplies, behavior that reflected psychological desperation more than tactical indiscipline. The propaganda apparatus within Germany struggled increasingly to maintain morale as evidence of impending defeat became overwhelming. Joseph Goebbels and his organization produced materials emphasizing German fighting spirit, the righteousness of the cause, and the terrible fate awaiting Germany if the Allies won, but these messages could not overcome the visceral reality that soldiers experienced on the front. Propaganda that worked when Germany was winning became transparently desperate when German forces were in headlong retreat. Soldiers began treating propaganda with cynical humor rather than belief, a psychological defense mechanism that further undermined official narratives but left nothing in their place except nihilism. The psychological state of German forces during the final months of the war combined elements of denial, desperation, and fatalism in unstable mixtures that varied by unit and individual. Some formations continued fighting with suicidal determination, not from belief in victory, but from unwillingness to accept defeat or fear of capture. Others collapsed at first contact, as soldiers decided individually that further resistance was pointless and survival required surrender. The inconsistency of German resistance reflected the psychological fragmentation of an army that had lost coherent purpose. Units that should have been tactically equivalent performed wildly differently based on the psychological state of their soldiers and leaders. The Hitler Youth and other ideologically indoctrinated units presented a disturbing variation on the theme of psychological collapse. Young soldiers who had been raised in Nazi ideology sometimes fought with fanatic intensity, precisely because they had no psychological framework for processing defeat. Where older soldiers could remember pre-Nazi Germany and imagine life after Hitler, many Hitler Youth had no adult memories of anything except the Third Reich. For them, German defeat meant not just military loss but existential annihilation of their entire worldview. The resulting psychological state produced either paralytic despair or berserker fury, both dysfunctional responses that made such units tactically unreliable despite their willingness to die. German civilian populations experienced psychological trauma parallel to that of military forces, as Allied advances brought the war directly into German territory. Civilians who had been told for years that German forces were winning watched ragged, defeated soldiers retreating through their towns, pursued by enemy forces of overwhelming strength. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda claims and visible reality created widespread psychological crisis. Some civilians directed their anger at military authorities for lying to them, while others blamed traitors and saboteurs for Germany's reversal of fortunes, unable to accept that German forces had simply been overwhelmed by superior resources. These psychological responses fed into the breakdown of social order in the final months of the war. The treatment of German prisoners by American forces provided another source of psychological shock. German soldiers had been told that capture by Americans meant torture, starvation, or execution, propaganda designed to encourage desperate resistance. When captured German soldiers instead received adequate food, medical care, and relatively humane treatment according to Geneva Convention standards, the contrast with their expectations created profound psychological disorientation. Some prisoners experienced guilt for having fought so long for a regime that had lied about everything, while others rationalized their experience as exceptional rather than typical. The psychological aftermath of these realizations would complicate German society's reckoning with Nazism for generations. The absolute collapse of German resistance in the final weeks of the war reflected psychological exhaustion as much as material defeat. By April of 1945, German forces had lost the will to continue organized resistance over large areas. Soldiers surrendered in masses, officers abandoned their commands, and civilian authorities welcomed Allied forces rather than resisting. This final collapse happened more rapidly than purely military factors would predict, suggesting that the psychological breaking point had been reached. The German military machine did not simply run out of fuel and ammunition. It ran out of psychological capacity to continue a war that had become not just unwinnable, but meaningless. The long-term psychological consequences of this collapse shaped post-war German society in profound ways. Veterans struggled to reconcile their military service with the reality of Nazi crimes and the totality of German defeat. The psychological need to find meaning in their suffering produced various narratives. Some emphasized that they had fought honorably despite serving an evil regime. Others claimed they had been deceived about Nazi ideology. Still others retreated into silence rather than confronting unbearable contradictions. The encounter with American logistics and the resulting military defeat became a source of complex psychological legacy, simultaneously humiliating and strangely liberating, as it enabled Germans to attribute their defeat to overwhelming material forces rather than moral or cultural inferiority. The machines that won the war. The Allied victory in World War II was fundamentally determined not by any single weapon system or technological breakthrough, but by an interconnected network of unglamorous machines that made modern mechanized warfare possible at unprecedented scale. While popular memory celebrates fighter planes, battleships, and tanks as the instruments of victory, the war was actually won by trucks, cargo ships, bulldozers, cranes, and the vast array of industrial equipment that moved supplies, constructed infrastructure, and sustained armies across multiple continents. These machines rarely appeared in newsreels or propaganda posters, yet without them, every tactical success would have been impossible, and every strategic advantage would have evaporated. The liberation of Europe was achieved not primarily through superior combat vehicles, but through superior logistics machines that could deliver overwhelming material resources to the battlefield faster and more reliably than any military force in history had previously managed. The 2.5-ton cargo truck, universally known as the Deuce and a Half, epitomized the unglamorous machinery that made victory possible. Over 500,000 of these vehicles were produced during the war, forming the backbone of American military transport. Each truck could carry approximately 5,000 pounds of cargo over rough terrain, and when organized into convoy systems, like the Red Ball Express, they moved millions of tons of supplies from ports to frontline units. The Deuce and a Half was not technologically sophisticated or particularly impressive in appearance, but its mechanical reliability and standardized design allowed it to function as a universal logistics solution. Drivers could operate these trucks with minimal training, mechanics could repair them using standardized parts, and units could depend on them to function day after day under conditions that would have destroyed less robust vehicles. The humble cargo truck did more to win the war than any fighter aircraft because it ensured that armies never stopped moving forward for lack of supplies. The Liberty ship represented industrial logistics on the grandest scale, demonstrating how mass production techniques could transform naval transportation. These cargo vessels were deliberately designed for rapid construction rather than elegance or longevity, with standardized components and welded hulls that allowed shipyards to complete vessels in as little as 42 days. From keel laying to launch, over 2,700 Liberty ships were built during the war, creating cargo capacity that dwarfed what had previously seemed possible. Each ship could carry over 10,000 tons of cargo across the Atlantic, and while individual vessels were vulnerable to submarines, the sheer numbers meant that even significant losses could not prevent massive supplies from reaching Europe. The Liberty ship was essentially a floating warehouse, purpose-built to solve the logistical equation of how to move American industrial production across an ocean to armies fighting thousands of miles from home. Construction equipment transformed the speed at which infrastructure could be built or repaired, giving Allied forces a decisive advantage in establishing logistics networks. Bulldozers, earth movers, and graders allowed engineer units to construct airfields in days, clear roads through debris in hours, and create supply depots almost overnight. American forces approached infrastructure as temporary and replaceable rather than permanent, using machines to create functional facilities quickly rather than building elaborate structures slowly. This philosophy meant that destroyed bridges were bypassed with temporary spans, damaged ports were supplemented with artificial harbors, and bombed airfields were repaired faster than the enemy could destroy them. The construction machines gave Allied forces the ability to reshape terrain to suit their logistics needs, an advantage that proved as important as any weapon. The Jeep became the iconic symbol of American mobility, serving functions far beyond its original design as a light reconnaissance vehicle. Over 640,000 Jeeps were produced, and they appeared everywhere in Allied operations, carrying officers to frontline positions, evacuating wounded soldiers, towing light artillery, laying communications wire, and performing countless improvised functions that their designers never anticipated. The Jeep's versatility reflected a design philosophy that prioritized mechanical simplicity and adaptability over specialized optimization. A single vehicle type that could perform dozens of different roles simplified logistics enormously compared to maintaining multiple specialized vehicle types. The Jeep represented democratic machinery, equally useful to a general visiting his troops and to a squad of infantry needing to move quickly along a road. Cargo aircraft, particularly the C-47 Dakota, extended logistics into 3 dimensions and enabled operations that would have been impossible relying solely on ground transport. These aircraft could deliver supplies to isolated units, evacuate casualties to rear hospitals, drop paratroopers behind enemy lines, and overcome terrain obstacles that would have stalled ground convoys. During the Siege of Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge, cargo aircraft sustained the surrounded garrison by dropping ammunition and medical supplies, allowing American forces to hold a critical position until relief arrived. The cargo plane, was not glamorous like a bomber or agile like a fighter, but it provided logistics flexibility that multiplied the effectiveness of ground forces. Tanker trucks and fuel transport systems formed a critical subset of logistics machinery that received little attention but determined whether mechanized armies could move at all. Specialized vehicles for transporting gasoline and diesel in bulk, including trucks with multiple compartments and tank trailers, allowed fuel to be distributed efficiently from ports and pipelines to forward units. The machinery for pumping fuel from ships to storage tanks, from tanks to trucks, and from trucks to vehicle fuel tanks was unglamorous, but essential. Without this network of fuel handling equipment, all the tanks and aircraft in the world would have been useless metal sculptures. The fuel transport and distribution machinery enabled the fundamental characteristic of mechanized warfare: the ability to project power rapidly over continental distances. Railroad equipment, both locomotives and rolling stock, provided the most efficient means of moving heavy cargo over long distances once rail lines were restored. American forces brought specialized railroad units that could rebuild destroyed tracks, repair damaged locomotives, and operate captured rail systems using standardized procedures. The combination of American railroad expertise and equipment with European rail infrastructure created logistics capacity far exceeding what trucks alone could provide. Heavy items like artillery pieces, large ammunition stocks, and construction materials moved most efficiently by rail, and American forces excelled at rapidly restoring rail capacity in liberated territories. Communications equipment formed another category of essential machinery that enabled logistics coordination. Radio sets, telephone systems, and telegraph equipment allowed supply officers to communicate with frontline units about their needs, coordinate convoy movements, track shipments across thousands of miles, and adjust logistics plans in real time. The machinery of communication was invisible to most soldiers but absolutely critical to maintaining the complex coordination that modern logistics required. Without reliable communications, the most abundant supplies were useless if they arrived at wrong locations or wrong times. Maintenance equipment and mobile repair facilities allowed the logistics machinery itself to continue functioning despite inevitable mechanical failures. Mobile workshops equipped with lathes, welding equipment, and diagnostic tools traveled with advancing forces, repairing broken vehicles and returning them to service within hours or days rather than weeks. This capability meant that mechanical failures did not permanently reduce transportation capacity, allowing the logistics system to maintain effectiveness despite the brutal conditions that machines endured. The machinery that repaired machinery was perhaps the most metacritical element of the entire system. Port handling equipment, including cranes, forklifts, and specialized cargo handling machinery, determined how quickly ships could be unloaded and supplies could begin their journey to the front. American forces brought standardized cargo handling equipment that could work with the standardized shipping containers and palletized cargo systems they had developed, dramatically reducing the time ships spent in port. The faster ships could be unloaded, the more cargo could be delivered with the same number of vessels, multiplying logistics capacity without building additional ships. The true genius of American logistics machinery was not that any individual machine was technologically superior to what other nations produced, but that the entire system was designed for interoperability, standardization, and mass production. Parts from one truck could repair another truck. Procedures learned on one machine transferred to similar machines, and the whole system scaled efficiently because adding more machines increased capacity proportionally. This systematic approach to logistics machinery reflected industrial thinking applied to warfare, treating supplies and transportation as engineering problems that could be solved through proper design and adequate resources. The machines that won the war were not those that destroyed enemy forces directly, but those that ensured Allied forces always had more resources than they needed, while enemy forces scrounged desperately for basic supplies. Victory came from the boring machinery of logistics overwhelming the enemy through relentless material superiority that ground down resistance until collapse became inevitable. The price of speed and sacrifice. The Allied strategy of rapid mechanized warfare across Western Europe extracted costs that extended far beyond the casualty figures recorded in official histories, encompassing human exhaustion, mechanical destruction, environmental devastation, and moral compromises that challenged the very principles the Allies claimed to be fighting for. The relentless pace of operations from the Normandy breakout through the final collapse of Nazi Germany was purchased through sacrifices that ranged from the mundane wearing out of equipment to the profound trauma experienced by soldiers, pushed beyond normal human endurance. Speed became both a tactical advantage and a merciless taskmaster that demanded payment in broken bodies, shattered minds, destroyed vehicles, and ethical compromises that participants rarely discussed but never forgot. The price was paid by truck drivers who fell asleep at the wheel and died in crashes that never made the newspapers, by infantrymen who advanced through exhaustion until their bodies simply gave out, by civilian populations whose homes became battlefields, and by the soldiers themselves who survived physically but carried psychological scars that would haunt them for decades. The human cost of maintaining the rapid operational tempo manifested most visibly in the physical breakdown of soldiers who were pushed far beyond normal endurance limits. Truck drivers of the Red Ball Express routinely operated their vehicles for 18 to 20 hours per day, navigating unfamiliar roads in darkness without adequate sleep. The inevitable result was a horrific accident rate that killed hundreds of drivers, not from enemy action, but from falling asleep at the wheel, losing control on damaged roads, or colliding with other vehicles in convoys operating under blackout conditions. These deaths were classified as non-combat casualties and received minimal official attention, yet they were as much war deaths as any combat fatality. The drivers knew the risks, but continued because the mission demanded it, and because refusing meant letting down comrades at the front who depended on the supplies they carried. Infantry units suffered from a different, but equally devastating form of attrition as they advanced continuously without adequate rest or rotation out of combat. Medical officers observed that soldiers developed a characteristic exhaustion syndrome after sustained combat exposure, displaying symptoms that included emotional numbing, inability to make decisions, and physical collapse even when not wounded. The military classified this as combat fatigue or battle exhaustion, recognizing it as a genuine medical condition that rendered soldiers temporarily or permanently unable to function effectively. Yet the operational demands of rapid advance meant that units continued fighting even when significant percentages of their soldiers were approaching psychological breakdown. Commanders faced terrible choices between maintaining offensive momentum and protecting the mental health of their men, and operational necessity almost always prevailed over humanitarian concern. The mechanical price of speed was equally severe, with vehicles and equipment being consumed at rates that would have bankrupted any previous military force. Trucks designed for a service life measured in years were instead driven until they literally fell apart after months of continuous operation. Tank engines that should have lasted thousands of miles failed after hundreds when operated at maximum stress under combat conditions. The maintenance system struggled constantly to keep equipment functional, cannibalizing broken vehicles for parts to keep others running, and accepting that much equipment would simply be discarded rather than repaired. This mechanical wastage was sustainable only because American industrial production could replace destroyed equipment faster than it was being consumed. But the environmental and economic costs were staggering, even if rarely calculated at the time. Civilian populations in the path of rapid military advances paid prices that varied from displacement and property destruction to death from artillery fire and aerial bombardment. The speed of Allied advances meant that battles swept through towns and villages with minimal warning, giving civilians little time to evacuate. French, Belgian, and German civilians watched their homes destroyed by artillery duels, Their fields churned into moonscapes by tank tracks, and their communities transformed into battlefields where normal life became impossible. The psychological trauma of experiencing modern mechanized warfare as a civilian observer was profound, particularly for children who witnessed violence and destruction that would shape their entire lives. Allied forces generally tried to minimize civilian casualties, but the operational tempo meant that careful discrimination between military and civilian targets was often impossible. The moral price of speed included compromises with principles of military justice and rules of engagement that commanders preferred not to discuss publicly. Units advancing rapidly sometimes bypassed pockets of German resistance rather than reducing them methodically, leaving enemy forces in rear areas where they occasionally killed logistics personnel or attacked supply convoys. The doctrine of accepting such risks to maintain momentum meant that soldiers not in frontline combat units faced dangers that traditional warfare would have eliminated through systematic rear area security. Supply troops and support personnel died in ambushes and raids that could have been prevented if operational tempo had allowed thorough consolidation of captured territory. The treatment of prisoners and handling of surrendering enemy forces became increasingly problematic, as the speed of advance created situations where frontline units could not spare soldiers to guard and evacuate large numbers of prisoners. Instances occurred where German soldiers attempting to surrender were shot because accepting their surrender would have slowed the advance or required detaching guards from combat units. Such actions violated the laws of war and the moral principles that Allied forces claimed to uphold, yet they emerged from the tactical realities of rapid mobile warfare, where any delay could mean missing operational opportunities. These moral compromises were rarely officially acknowledged, but were known to participants and contributed to the psychological burden that veterans carried. The medical system faced overwhelming demands as casualties accumulated faster than the evacuation and treatment system could process them. Field hospitals operated in conditions of barely controlled chaos, with surgeons working consecutive shifts until they were making decisions while cognitively impaired from exhaustion. The triage system that determined which wounded soldiers received treatment first necessarily meant that some men with survivable injuries died because resources had to be devoted to those with better chances of survival. Medical personnel carried the moral weight of these decisions, knowing that in a slower-paced campaign, with more resources, they might have saved additional lives. The speed of operations created medical crises that no amount of supplies could fully address because the bottleneck was skilled personnel performing complex procedures under impossible conditions. The psychological aftermath of rapid mechanized warfare created a generation of veterans who struggled to process their experiences in a society that celebrated victory without fully understanding its costs. Soldiers returned home carrying memories of killing, watching friends die, enduring terror, and making moral compromises that civilian society preferred not to acknowledge. The culture of stoicism that characterized that generation meant that most veterans never fully discussed their experiences, instead carrying psychological burdens in silence that manifested as nightmares, depression, substance abuse, and damaged relationships. The true psychological price of the rapid victory was paid over decades in veterans' lives, in broken families, and in trauma that was transmitted intergenerationally to children who grew up with fathers haunted by experiences they could not articulate. The environmental destruction caused by mechanized warfare at speed was catastrophic for affected regions, with landscapes transformed into wastelands by artillery, aerial bombardment, and the physical passage of armies. Forests were reduced to splintered stumps. Agricultural land was rendered unusable by unexploded ordnance and contamination, and water sources were polluted by fuel spills and chemical contamination. The cleanup and restoration process took decades, and in some areas remains incomplete even generations later. This environmental cost was invisible in strategic calculations, but represented a real price paid by communities trying to rebuild after liberation. The financial cost of the rapid advance was astronomical, even by the standards of total war. The United States spent resources at rates that seemed unlimited during the campaign, but that represented real economic costs that would burden future generations. The decision to prioritize speed over efficiency meant accepting waste on scales that peacetime economics would never tolerate, from discarded equipment to fuel consumed in inefficient transport. This financial sacrifice was judged worthwhile to end the war sooner and save lives that prolonged fighting would have cost, but it represented a deliberate choice to value time over treasure in ways that shaped post-war economic realities. The ultimate question of whether the price paid for speed was justified remains debated by historians. Advocates argue that rapid victory saved lives overall by ending the war months earlier than a more methodical approach would have achieved, that every week of continued German control meant additional Holocaust victims and occupied populations suffering, and that the moral calculus clearly favored speed despite its costs. Critics contend that more careful operations could have achieved similar results with lower casualties and less waste, that some of the speed was motivated by commanders' ambition rather than strategic necessity, and that the human and material costs were higher than official histories acknowledge. The truth likely contains elements of both perspectives, recognizing that speed did save lives overall, while acknowledging that the price was paid disproportionately by particular groups of soldiers and civilians whose sacrifices received insufficient recognition in popular narratives of triumphant victory. When logistics became strategy. The Second World War marked a fundamental transformation in military thinking, where logistics ceased to be merely the practical implementation of strategic decisions and instead became the primary determinant of what strategies were even possible. This inversion of traditional military hierarchy represented one of the most profound shifts in the history of warfare. Yet it occurred gradually and was barely recognized even by many of the commanders and planners who were experiencing it. Throughout most of military history, strategists had conceived operations based on geographic objectives, enemy dispositions, and tactical opportunities, then tasked logistics officers with finding ways to support those operations. By 1944, this relationship had reversed in the Allied command structure. Logistics officers calculated what supply systems could sustain, and strategists designed operations that fit within those logistical constraints. The capacity to deliver fuel, ammunition, and supplies to particular locations at particular rates became the foundational reality upon which all strategic choices were built, meaning that mastery of supply chains and transportation networks mattered more than brilliance in conventional military strategy. This transformation became undeniably apparent during the debates over Allied strategy in autumn of 1944, when the question of how to advance into Germany generated conflicts that were fundamentally logistical rather than tactical or strategic in nature. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery advocated for a concentrated thrust through the Netherlands toward the Ruhr industrial region, arguing that this approach would mass combat power at a decisive point and potentially end the war quickly. General Omar Bradley and General George Patton favored a broad front advance that would keep pressure on German forces across multiple sectors while preventing them from concentrating reserves against any single thrust. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower ultimately chose a compromise that satisfied neither camp completely. But the critical point was that all of these strategic debates were constrained absolutely by logistical realities. The actual strategic question was not which approach would be militarily superior in abstract terms, but which approach the existing logistics infrastructure could sustain, given the distances involved, the port capacity available, and the transportation assets that could be allocated. The priority given to capturing and opening the port of Antwerp illustrated how logistics had become strategy. Montgomery's failure to immediately clear the Scheldt estuary and bring Antwerp into full operation is often cited as one of his major strategic errors, but the significance lay in how this logistical failure constrained all subsequent operations. Without Antwerp's port capacity, Allied forces remained dependent on supplies transported hundreds of miles from Normandy, which created an absolute ceiling on how many divisions could be sustained in offensive operations, regardless of how many troops were theoretically available. Strategic maneuver became impossible, not because German forces blocked particular routes, but because the mathematics of fuel consumption and delivery capacity simply did not permit certain operations. Logistics officers could calculate with precision how many tons of supplies could be delivered to frontline units at various distances from available ports, and those calculations determined which strategic options were feasible. The construction of pipelines across France represented logistics as strategic investment, where resources devoted to transportation infrastructure competed directly with resources for combat operations, but ultimately enabled strategic possibilities that would otherwise have been impossible. The pipeline from Cherbourg to forward areas was a massive engineering project that consumed materials, labor, and time that could have been used for other purposes, yet once operational, it fundamentally changed the strategic equation by allowing fuel to flow continuously without consuming itself in transport via trucks. The decision to build the pipeline was strategic in nature, a choice about how to allocate limited resources to maximize long-term operational capacity rather than short-term tactical gain. Military planners were thinking like industrial engineers, optimizing supply chains and calculating return on investment in infrastructure with the same methodologies used by businesses managing complex logistics networks. The systematic approach to supply distribution revealed how industrial management principles had infiltrated military strategy. The Red Ball Express was not merely an emergency response, but represented a conscious strategic choice to dedicate massive transportation resources to a single function, accepting inefficiency in individual truck usage to maximize overall throughput. This decision reflected logistics thinking at the strategic level, where the goal was not tactical elegance, but systemic capacity to deliver overwhelming material superiority to combat forces. Traditional military strategy emphasized concentration of combat power at decisive points, but the new logistics as strategy paradigm recognized that concentrating supply capacity was equally important and often more challenging than concentrating combat units. The allocation of shipping capacity between theaters became one of the highest-level strategic decisions of the war, determining what operations were possible in Europe versus the Pacific, and this was purely a logistical question. The number of cargo ships available, their carrying capacity, and the distances they needed to travel created absolute constraints on how many divisions could be deployed and sustained in different regions. Strategic planning began with logistics officers calculating shipping requirements for various operational scenarios, and military strategy was then crafted to fit within the envelope of what shipping could support. This represented a complete reversal of traditional military planning, where logistics adapted to strategy rather than strategy adapting to logistics. The timing of major operations was increasingly determined by logistical readiness rather than tactical opportunity. The Normandy invasion could not occur until sufficient landing craft, supply ships, and support vessels were assembled, regardless of when weather or enemy dispositions might have been favorable. The crossing of the Rhine was delayed in some sectors, not because German defenses were impenetrable, but because logistics officers needed time to stockpile the ammunition and supplies necessary to support the operation. This subordination of operational timing to logistical preparation reflected the new reality that modern mechanized armies consumed resources so rapidly that operations could not be sustained through improvisation or living off the land as earlier armies had done. The intellectual transformation required for senior officers to accept logistics as strategy was profound and uneven. Traditional military culture valued tactical brilliance, operational art, and strategic vision, while treating logistics as a necessary but subordinate technical function. Officers who had spent careers studying the campaigns of Napoleon, Frederick the Great, and other classical commanders found themselves in a war where the principles derived from those studies had limited applicability. The generals who succeeded in this new environment were those who could think simultaneously as warriors and industrial managers, understanding that victory required both the courage to fight and the administrative capacity to sustain fighting indefinitely through superior organization. The German failure to make this intellectual transition contributed significantly to their defeat. German operational planning often displayed tactical and operational brilliance, but was consistently undermined by logistical impossibility. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944 exemplified this disconnect, where German planners designed an operationally ambitious offensive without adequately solving the fundamental logistical problem of how to fuel it beyond the initial advance. German forces were expected to capture American fuel supplies to sustain their offensive, a plan that reflected desperation rather than serious logistics strategy. When captured supplies proved insufficient, the offensive ground to a halt, not because of tactical defeat, but logistical starvation. The American success in making logistics into strategy reflected broader cultural advantages in industrial organization and systems thinking. American officers were often drawn from a society where large-scale industrial management was a respected profession, where efficiency and optimization were valued, and where complex organizational systems were understood as requiring specialized expertise. This cultural background made it easier for American military planners to accept that logistics expertise was as valuable as tactical skill, and to create command structures where logistics officers had genuine authority over strategic decisions rather than being expected to simply implement whatever combat commanders decided. The legacy that changed the world. The logistical systems developed and refined during World War II did not disappear with the German surrender in May of 1945, but instead fundamentally transformed how the modern world functions across virtually every domain of organized human activity. The principles, practices, and innovations that enabled the Allies to project military power across oceans and continents became the foundation for post-war global commerce, international development, humanitarian assistance, and the emergence of the United States as a superpower capable of intervening anywhere on Earth. The containerization concepts that began with military cargo handling evolved into the standardized shipping containers that now carry 90% of global trade. The supply chain management techniques developed to coordinate millions of tons of military supplies became the basis for just-in-time manufacturing and modern retail distribution. The organizational structures created to manage complex logistics operations influenced corporate management theory for generations. Perhaps most profoundly, the demonstration that superior logistics could overcome almost any other military advantage permanently altered how nations conceived of power and security, establishing that industrial capacity and organizational excellence were at least as important as traditional military virtues like courage and tactical skill. The physical infrastructure, created to support wartime logistics, became the skeleton of the post-war global economy. Airfields, built to support military operations, were converted into commercial airports that formed the backbone of international air travel and cargo transport. Port facilities expanded, or constructed for military purposes, became major centers of global trade. The highway networks, built or improved to support military transport, provided the foundation for economic development across Europe and connected previously isolated regions into integrated markets. This infrastructure was not merely repurposed military construction, but represented a permanent increase in human capacity to move goods and people across distances, enabling economic integration that would have been impossible with pre-war transportation networks. The concept of global supply chains as manageable systems emerged directly from military logistics experience. Before the war, international commerce existed, but was largely conducted through relatively simple bilateral relationships and regional trading networks. The military logistics system demonstrated that vastly more complex networks could be coordinated systematically, with goods flowing from multiple sources through intermediate processing and distribution points to final destinations according to sophisticated scheduling and priority systems. Business leaders who had served in military logistics roles or observed the system's effectiveness recognized that similar approaches could revolutionize civilian commerce. The result was the gradual emergence of multinational corporations that sourced components globally, manufactured products in multiple countries, and distributed them worldwide through integrated logistics networks that would have been inconceivable before the organizational innovations of wartime logistics. The professionalization of logistics and supply chain management as distinct career fields and academic disciplines traced directly to wartime experience. Universities began offering courses and eventually degrees in logistics, operations management, and supply chain optimization, treating these subjects as intellectually serious fields requiring specialized expertise rather than mere practical skills subordinate to other business functions. This academic legitimization reflected the recognition that the logistical challenges faced during the war had required genuine innovation and sophisticated analytical thinking, not just diligent execution of routine procedures. The professors who founded these academic programs were often veterans who had managed military supply systems and recognized that the principles they had applied in warfare had broad civilian applications. The geopolitical legacy of superior logistics capability shaped the entire Cold War era and continues to define American power in the 21st century. The United States emerged from World War II as the only nation with proven capacity to project military force globally and sustain it indefinitely through sophisticated logistics networks. This capability became the foundation of American global influence, enabling military commitments in Europe through NATO, in Asia through treaties with Japan and South Korea, and intervention capability in regional conflicts worldwide. Soviet military planners studied American logistics extensively and attempted to replicate its capabilities but never achieved equivalent effectiveness, partly due to inferior industrial capacity, but also because of organizational rigidities that prevented the kind of adaptive problem-solving that characterized American logistics. The ability to deploy and sustain military forces anywhere in the world became a defining characteristic of superpower status, and the logistics revolution of World War II was what made such global reach possible. The humanitarian applications of advanced logistics capability transformed international disaster response and development assistance. Organizations like the United Nations and various non-governmental organizations adopted logistics principles developed during the war to deliver food aid, medical supplies, and relief materials to populations affected by natural disasters, famines, and conflicts. The capacity to rapidly organize complex supply chains, coordinate multiple transport modes, and distribute resources efficiently in chaotic environments came directly from military logistics experience. Many leaders of humanitarian organizations were veterans who applied lessons learned moving military supplies to the challenge of moving humanitarian aid, recognizing that the underlying organizational principles were similar, even though the purposes were radically different. The technological innovations driven by logistics needs during the war spawned entire new industries in the post-war era. The development of air cargo capability led to specialized freight aircraft and eventually to express delivery services that could move packages globally within days. The refinement of refrigeration technology to preserve food during long supply chains enabled global trade in perishable goods and fundamentally changed agricultural economics. The communications systems developed to coordinate logistics operations evolved into commercial telecommunications networks. Computing technology developed partly to manage complex logistics calculations, found its first widespread civilian application in business logistics before expanding into the omnipresent information technology of the modern world. The psychological legacy of the logistics achievement reshaped how Americans understood their nation's role in the world and the sources of national power. The war demonstrated that American strength lay not primarily in martial traditions or military culture, which were less developed than in many other nations, but in industrial capacity, organizational skill, and ability to solve complex practical problems through systematic application of resources and intelligence. This self-understanding influenced post-war American identity, encouraging confidence in technology and organization as solutions to national and global challenges. The can-do attitude that characterized American culture in the decades after the war reflected partly the experience of having solved seemingly impossible logistics problems through determination and systematic effort. The environmental consequences of the logistics revolution were profound, though not fully recognized for decades. The massive consumption of petroleum products during the war normalized oil-based transportation and established infrastructure dependent on fossil fuels that would shape energy politics and environmental challenges for the rest of the century. The capacity to move goods globally created economic incentives for resource extraction and manufacturing patterns that had significant environmental impacts. The very success of the logistics systems made efficient resource use less economically important than maximizing throughput and speed, establishing patterns of consumption and waste that contributed to long-term environmental degradation. The influence on management theory and business education was equally transformative. The concepts of systematic planning, quantitative analysis, optimization of complex systems, and professional management of specialized functions all received validation and practical demonstration through wartime logistics. Business schools incorporated these concepts into curricula, creating generations of managers who approached business challenges with tools and frameworks derived from military logistics experience. The idea that complex organizations could be managed scientifically through proper analysis and systematic procedures became dominant in American business culture, displacing older models based on intuition and personal relationships. The social legacy included broader acceptance of women and minorities in roles requiring technical expertise and organizational responsibility. The necessity of utilizing all available human resources during the war created opportunities for groups previously excluded from many professional roles. And while post-war retrenchment reversed many gains, the demonstration that diverse personnel could manage complex logistics operations challenged assumptions about who was capable of professional work. The African American soldiers of the Red Ball Express and women who worked in logistics roles during the war had proven their capabilities in ways that contributed to longer-term social change. Even though progress was frustratingly slow, the ultimate legacy was establishing logistics as a permanent component of strategic thinking in all large-scale human endeavors, whether planning military operations, organizing disaster response, managing global corporations, or coordinating international development projects. Leaders now begin by considering logistics, capabilities, and constraints, rather than treating them as afterthoughts. The World War II experience proved conclusively that brilliant strategies fail without adequate logistics, while even modest strategies succeed when supported by superior logistics capabilities. This lesson has been internalized so completely that it shapes how modern organizations approach virtually every complex challenge, making the logistics revolution one of the most consequential but least celebrated transformations of the 20th century. The story of American logistics in World War II reveals a profound truth that echoes through history. Wars are won not merely by those who fight bravest, but by those who can sustain the fight longest and strongest. German generals learned too late that their contempt for supply chains was a fatal miscalculation, that courage without gasoline meant immobilized armies, and that tactical brilliance could not overcome systematic material inferiority. The unglamorous work of moving supplies, maintaining equipment, and coordinating vast networks of transportation proved more decisive than any battle. Today, the principles forged in that crucible continue shaping how modern militaries project power, how corporations manage global operations, and how humanitarian organizations respond to crises worldwide. The mechanics, truck drivers, logistics planners, and supply officers who enabled victory deserve remembrance alongside combat heroes, for they pioneered systems that transformed our world. Share this untold story with anyone fascinated by how history really unfolds. Subscribe to discover more hidden forces that shaped our modern world. Leave a comment about how logistics impacts your understanding of military power and global commerce. And remember that the greatest victories often belong to those who solve unglamorous problems with extraordinary excellence.